When basketball legend Michael Jordan spots an elderly woman struggling with grocery bags on a run-down street in his hometown, he has no idea his life is about to change forever. The woman is Mrs. Eleanor Winters, his fourth-grade teacher who once encouraged him after he was cut from his high school team. Now, she's living in poverty, choosing between medicine and food on her small teacher's pension. What begins as a simple act of kindness becomes much more as Michael uncovers a nationwide crisis. Thousands of retired teachers living in poverty after dedicating their lives to educating others. Michael's response will grow into something far bigger than anyone imagined, culminating in a billion-dollar initiative that stuns the world and changes how America values its educators. But the most shocking revelation is still to come. A secret Mrs. Winters has kept for decades that connects directly to Michael's legendary basketball career. Michael Jordan tapped his fingers on the steering wheel of his sleek black SUV. The GPS voice told him to turn left, guiding him through a part of Wilmington, North Carolina he barely recognized anymore. Tall buildings had replaced some of the old shops he remembered from his childhood, but as he drove further from downtown, the fancy stores disappeared. The streets got narrower. The houses looked tired. He was supposed to be looking at spots for a new community center. His foundation wanted to build something special for kids in his hometown. But his mind kept drifting to the business meeting he had later that day. "Recalculating," said the GPS voice when he missed a turn. Michael sighed and slowed down at a red light. Through his tinted windows, he watched people walking by. A young mom pushing a stroller, two teenage boys laughing over something on a phone, and then he noticed an elderly woman struggling with several grocery bags. Something about her seemed familiar. The way she walked, maybe? The light was still red as he watched her shift the heavy bags from one hand to the other. She wore a faded blue coat that had seen better days. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, but wisps had escaped in the wind. The woman stopped to catch her breath. One of her grocery bags ripped suddenly, sending cans rolling across the sidewalk. An orange bounced into the street. Without thinking, Michael pulled his car to the curb. The light had turned green, and cars behind him honked in anger, but he ignored them. He stepped out into the chilly February air and jogged toward the woman. "Let me help you with that, ma'am," he said, bending down to gather the spilled groceries. "Oh, thank you, young man. These old hands don't grip like they used to," she said without looking up. Michael collected the cans of soup and vegetables, placing them carefully in his large hands. The woman finally glanced up at him, and her eyes widened with recognition. "My goodness," she whispered. "Michael? Michael Jordan?" He looked at her more closely now, and something clicked in his memory. The kind eyes, the gentle smile, the way she tilted her head slightly when she spoke. "Mrs. Winters?" he asked in disbelief. "Mrs. Eleanor Winters?" She nodded, her weathered face breaking into a wide smile. "I can't believe it's you, after all these years." Michael stood still, memories flooding back. Mrs. Winters had been his fourth-grade teacher at Ogden Elementary School. She was the teacher who had stayed after school to help him with math when numbers jumbled in his young mind. She was the one who had written him that encouraging note when he got cut from the varsity basketball team in high school. "Mrs. Winters," he repeated, shaking his head in amazement. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" Her smile faltered slightly. "Oh, I live just down the block now, in the Pinewood Apartments." She gestured toward a run-down brick building with peeling paint and rusty fire escapes. Michael frowned. Pinewood Apartments was not a place anyone would choose to live if they had options. The building had been old when he was a kid. Now it looked downright dangerous. "I've got my car right here," he said, pointing to his SUV. "Can I give you a ride home? These bags look heavy." Mrs. Winters hesitated. I don't want to be a bother. It's no bother at all, Michael insisted. He gathered the rest of her groceries and guided her to his car. The contrast between his luxury vehicle and her worn clothes made him uncomfortable in a way he couldn't quite name. As they drove the short distance to her apartment building, Mrs. Winters asked about his family, his business ventures, and his foundation work. Not once did she mention his basketball career, which somehow meant more to him than if she had. Here we are, she said when they reached the building. Michael parked and insisted on carrying her groceries up to her apartment. The elevator was broken, so they climbed 3 flights of stairs slowly. He pretended not to notice how she had to stop to catch her breath between floors. Her apartment was small but spotlessly clean. Faded curtains hung at the windows, and the furniture looked like it belonged to another decade. But there were books everywhere, stacked on tables, lined up on homemade shelves, piled beside a worn armchair. Would you like some tea? She asked, as if a billionaire basketball legend stopped by her apartment every day. I'd love some, Michael said, even though he never drank tea. He noticed a leak in the corner of the ceiling, a bucket placed underneath to catch drips. As Mrs. Winters busied herself in the tiny kitchen, Michael noticed a framed photo on a side table. It showed a much younger Mrs. Winters standing with a group of students. With a jolt, he recognized his 10-year-old self in the back row, all skinny arms and bright smile. You kept this all these years? He asked when she returned with 2 steaming mugs. Of course I did, she said, sitting down carefully in an armchair with worn cushions. That was my favorite class. So many bright minds. How long did you teach? At Ogden? Michael asked. 40 years altogether, she said proudly. Retired about 8 years ago. Something didn't add up. A teacher with 40 years of service should be living comfortably in retirement, not in a building with broken elevators and leaky ceilings. Mrs. Winters, he began carefully. Are you doing okay? I mean, financially and everything? Her smile dimmed, and she looked down at her tea. Well, I get by, Michael. Things got a bit difficult after Harold, my husband, passed away. The medical bills, you know. And our house. She trailed off, then squared her shoulders. But that's enough. About me. Tell me what brings you back to Wilmington. Michael explained about the community center his foundation wanted to build, but his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't stop thinking about Mrs. Winters's situation. This woman who had shaped so many young lives, including his own, was living in near poverty. It felt deeply wrong. As they chatted about old times and mutual acquaintances, Michael made a silent promise to himself. He didn't know exactly what he would do, but he knew he had to help. Mrs. Winters had believed in him when he was just a kid with dreams. Now it was his turn to do something for her. When he finally said goodbye an hour later, he had her phone number programmed into his cell phone and a plan forming in his mind. It was so wonderful to see you, Michael, Mrs. Winters said, standing in her doorway. You've made an old teacher very happy today. The pleasure was mine, he replied, meaning it more than she could know. And, Mrs. Winters, I'll be in touch soon. As he drove away, Michael pulled out his phone and dialed his business manager. Tristan, he said, the moment the call connected. Cancel my meetings tomorrow. Something important has come up. But, sir, the investors have flown in from... Reschedule it, Michael said firmly. This can't wait. He hung up before Tristan could argue further. Michael wasn't used to explaining himself, and he didn't feel like starting now. His mind was racing with questions about Mrs. Winters's situation. The next morning, Michael sent a text message to Mrs. Winters asking if she'd join him for breakfast. Her reply came quickly, with a polite suggestion for Denny's on Market Street. Michael chuckled to himself. He had been planning to invite her to the five-star restaurant in his hotel, but Denny's would work just fine. When he pulled into the parking lot, Mrs. Winters was already waiting outside, wearing the same blue coat from yesterday but with a colorful scarf around her neck. She looked smaller in the daylight, more fragile. "Good morning, Michael," she said, with a bright smile. "I hope I didn't mess up your schedule." "Not at all," he assured her, holding the door open. "I'm glad you could meet me." Inside, they slid into a booth near the back. A young waitress approached, looking tired until she recognized Michael. Her eyes went wide. "Oh my gosh, you're—" "Just a man having breakfast with his teacher," Michael said gently. "Could we get some coffee, please?" After they ordered pancakes for Michael, oatmeal for Mrs. Winters, Michael leaned forward. "Mrs. Winters, I hope. You don't mind me asking, but I can't stop thinking about your situation. What happened after you retired?" She stirred her coffee slowly, as if gathering her thoughts. "It's not a very exciting story," she said finally. "I taught for 40 years, loved every minute of it. Well, most minutes." She smiled. "Harold and I had a nice little house over in Pine Valley. We had plans to travel after I retired." Her smile faded. "Then Harold got sick. Cancer. He fought it for 3 years, but—" She shook her head. "The insurance covered some things, but not everything. Experimental treatments, home care, special equipment. It adds up faster than you can imagine." Michael nodded, listening intently. "We had savings, of course, but it wasn't enough. We had to take out a second mortgage on the house. After Harold passed, I couldn't keep up with the payments on just my pension." Mrs. Winters looked out the window. "I sold the house about 2 years ago. Found the apartment. It's not much, but it's what I can afford." "What about family?" Michael asked. "Children?" "We weren't blessed that way," she said simply. "I had my students. Thousands of them over the years. That was enough for us." Their food arrived, creating a brief pause in the conversation. Michael watched as Mrs. Winters carefully cut her oatmeal into smaller portions, as if making it last longer. "How much is your pension?" he asked directly. Mrs. Winters looked uncomfortable. "That's not something I usually discuss." "I understand," Michael said quickly. "I'm sorry if that was too personal." She sighed. "No, it's all right. It's about $1,700 a month. After rent, utilities, and my medications, there's not much left. Some months I have to choose between filling all my prescriptions or buying groceries." Michael felt a wave of anger. This woman had shaped young minds for 4 decades, and this was her reward? "Why didn't you apply for assistance programs?" "Oh, I did," she said. "I get some help with the heating bill in winter, but I don't qualify for much else. My pension puts me just above the cutoff for most programs." She smiled wryly. "Too poor to live comfortably, too rich for help." "What about the teachers' union? Retirement benefits?" "Our state's teacher retirement system isn't the best," she explained, "and I started teaching before some of the better protections were put in place. Bad timing, I suppose." Michael shook his head in disbelief. "It's not right. After everything you've done—" "Now, don't you worry about me," Mrs. Winters said firmly. "I've had a good life, better than many. I got to do work that mattered." She reached across the table and patted his hand. "I got to teach wonderful children who grew into amazing adults. That's worth more than money." But Michael wasn't convinced. "Tell me about your apartment. That ceiling leak. How long has that been happening?" "Oh, a few months now. The building manager says he'll fix it, but they're short-staffed." She waved a hand dismissively. "It's just a little water. And the elevator? Broken more often than not. The stairs are good exercise for these old bones. She chuckled, but Michael didn't smile. What about your health? You mentioned medications. Mrs. Winters looked down at her half-eaten oatmeal. Just the usual things for someone my age. Blood, pressure, arthritis, a heart condition that needs monitoring. She brightened suddenly. But enough about all that. Tell me about you. I've followed your career, you know. I still have all the newspaper clippings. You kept articles about me? Michael asked, touched. Of course I did. Every game, every championship, every business venture, I have scrapbooks full. Her eyes sparkled with pride. I used to tell my students, I taught Michael Jordan, you know, not basketball, that he figured out himself. But I taught him fractions. Despite his concerns, Michael laughed. You taught me more than fractions, Mrs. Winters. Call me Eleanor, please. You're not in 4th grade anymore. Michael shook his head. I don't think I can. You'll always be Mrs. Winters to me. They spent the next hour talking about old classmates and teachers. Mrs. Winters remembered details about students from 30 years ago as if she'd seen them yesterday. She asked about Michael's children, his divorce, his businesses. She knew about his baseball career, his return to basketball, his championships. I watched every game I could, she said. Sometimes I had to go to a sports bar to see the playoffs. The other teachers thought I was crazy, this old lady cheering at the TV screen. As they finished breakfast, Michael noticed Mrs. Winters had wrapped half her toast in a napkin and slipped it into her purse when she thought he wasn't looking. The sight made his chest tighten. Let me drive you home, he offered when they finished. Thank you, but I need to stop at the pharmacy first, she said. It's my day to pick up medications. I'll take you there too. At the pharmacy, Michael waited in the car to give her privacy. Through the window, he saw her talking to the pharmacist, who was shaking his head. Mrs. Winters dug through her purse, counting out bills. When she returned to the car, her expression was carefully neutral, but Michael noticed she was carrying a smaller bag than he expected. Everything okay? He asked. Just fine, she said brightly. They were out of one of my prescriptions. They'll have it next week. Michael wasn't fooled, but he didn't press the issue. After he dropped her off at her apartment, promising to stay in touch, he sat in his car for a long time. The contrast between his life and hers was stark. He thought about the mansion he owned, the private jets, the millions in his bank accounts, and then he thought about Mrs. Winters counting dollar bills at the pharmacy counter. He picked up his phone and called Tristan again. I need you to set up a meeting, Michael said. Start researching everything you can about teacher pensions and retirement benefits, and find me the best elder care attorney in North Carolina. What's this about, sir? Tristan asked. Michael stared up at the decaying apartment building where his former teacher now lived. It's about doing what's right, he said. And it starts today. Michael hung up the phone and headed back to his hotel. The rest of the day passed in a blur of phone calls and research. By evening, his eyes burned from staring at his laptop screen, reading article after article about teacher pensions and the challenges facing retired educators. The luxury suite at the Wilmington Grand Hotel felt too big, too empty, too fancy. Michael ordered room service, but barely touched the expensive steak. His mind kept drifting back to Mrs. Winters and her half-eaten oatmeal at Denny's. He tried to watch TV, flipping through channels without really seeing what was on. Eventually, he turned it off and got ready for bed. But sleep wouldn't come. Michael stared at the ceiling, thinking about Mrs. Winters living in that run-down apartment building with its broken elevator and leaky ceiling. The image wouldn't leave him alone. He got up and walked to the window. The city lights sparkled below, but all he could see was Mrs. Winters counting dollar bills at the pharmacy counter. Memories flooded back from his childhood. Mrs. Winters staying after school to help him with math problems when numbers jumbled in his young mind. The way she never made him feel stupid when he got something wrong. Her patient voice saying, "Try again, Michael. I know you can do this." He remembered her attending his junior varsity basketball games when even his friends didn't show up, sitting alone in the bleachers, grading papers between plays, but never missing a moment when he had the ball. The memory that kept coming back strongest was from his sophomore year of high school, the day the varsity team list was posted without his name on it. Michael had been devastated, hiding in the gym bathroom so no one would see him cry. Somehow, Mrs. Winters had found him there. She didn't offer empty praise or tell him the coaches had made a mistake. Instead, she handed him a small note card, with words he still remembered. "Failure is not the falling down, Michael. It's the staying down." Those words had become his personal motto. Through every setback in his career, every lost game, every business challenge, he heard Mrs. Winters's voice in his head. Failure is not the falling down, it's the staying down. And now she was the one who had fallen. Not through any fault of her own, but because a system had failed her. A system that didn't value teachers enough to ensure they could live with dignity after decades of service. Michael paced the hotel room, too restless to sleep. The clock on the nightstand showed 2:17 a.m. He grabbed his phone and started making notes. Ideas, questions, possibilities. The more he wrote, the clearer his thoughts became. By 3:30 a.m., he had the beginnings of a plan. It wasn't fully formed yet, but it was a start. He would help Mrs. Winters, of course. That was step one. But maybe there was a bigger picture, a larger problem he could address. How many other teachers were like Mrs. Winters? How many had shaped young lives only to struggle in their golden years? The question nagged at him. He opened his laptop again, searching for statistics on teacher retirement. The numbers shocked him. In some states, the average teacher pension fell below the poverty line. Many retired educators had to take part-time jobs well into their 70s just to afford basic necessities. This wasn't just about Mrs. Winters anymore. It was about all the Mrs. Winters out there, all the teachers who had given their best years to children, who had shaped futures while sacrificing their own financial security. Around 5 a.m., exhaustion finally caught up with him. Michael lay down on top of the hotel bed, still fully dressed. His last thoughts before drifting off were of Mrs. Winters's voice from all those years ago. "You have such potential, Michael, not just in basketball, but in life. Someday, you'll do important things. Things that matter." He woke to sunlight streaming through the window and his phone ringing loudly. The clock showed 9:45 a.m. "Hello?" he answered groggily. "Michael, it's Tristan. I've been calling for an hour. Are you okay?" Michael sat up, suddenly wide awake as yesterday's events and last night's ideas came rushing back. "I'm fine," he said, his voice clear and determined. "Better than fine. I know what we need to do." "About the teacher?" "Sir, I've already looked into setting up a trust fund for her. It's simple enough." "No," Michael interrupted. "Well, yes, we'll do that too. But I'm thinking bigger, Tristan, much bigger." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Sir? How much bigger are we talking?" Michael looked out the window at the city where he had grown up, where Mrs. Winters had taught him more than just fractions. "Meet me for breakfast in 30 minutes, he said, "and bring a notebook. We've got work to do." Michael showered quickly and headed downstairs to the hotel restaurant. Tristan Powell was already waiting, looking sharp in his gray suit, despite the early hour. At 42, Tristan had been Michael's business manager for over a decade. He was efficient, discreet, and rarely surprised by anything. Today would be different. "Good morning, sir," Tristan said, standing as Michael approached. A notebook and tablet lay ready on the table. "Morning," Michael replied, sliding into the booth. "Let's order first. I'm starving." After a server took their orders, Michael leaned forward. "What have you found out about Mrs. Winters' situation?" Tristan tapped his tablet. Eleanor Winters, age 78. Taught at Ogden Elementary for 27 years, then at Pender Heights Elementary for 13 years. Retired 8 years ago with 40 years of service. He looked up. Her pension is $1,732 per month. "That's it?" Michael asked, though he already knew the answer from Mrs. Winters herself. Yes, her husband, Harold Winters, was an insurance adjuster. He died 5 years ago after a long battle with pancreatic cancer. Their savings were depleted by medical bills not covered by insurance. And the house? Sold 2 years ago. Current residence is a 1-bedroom apartment in Pinewood Apartments. Rent is $850 per month. Michael did the math quickly. Less than $900 left each month for utilities, food, medications, and everything else. What about her health? Tristan hesitated. "I couldn't access her medical records, of course, but I spoke with her former colleague who mentioned heart problems, arthritis, and diabetes." Michael nodded grimly. The server brought their breakfast, and they ate in silence for a few minutes. "So, what's your plan?" Tristan finally asked. Michael set down his fork. "I want to buy her a house. Nothing fancy, but comfortable. Something close to her church and doctor's offices. Set up a trust fund to cover all her expenses for the rest of her life. Make sure she never has to worry about money again." Tristan nodded, making notes. "That's very generous. We can have it done within a week?" "Good. But that's just the beginning." Tristan looked up, his pen hovering over the notebook. "Sir?" Michael pushed his half-eaten breakfast aside. "I kept thinking about this all night. Mrs. Winters isn't the only teacher living like this. There are thousands of them out there, people who dedicated their lives to education only to struggle in retirement. You want to help other teachers too?" Tristan asked, his voice careful. "Yes. I'm thinking of a foundation. Something focused specifically on supporting retired educators in need." Tristan's eyebrows rose slightly, but he kept his professional composure. "That's a much bigger undertaking than helping one person. I know. That's why I need you to start putting a team together. Lawyers, financial advisors, education specialists. People who understand this issue from all angles." "How much are you looking to commit to this project?" Tristan asked. Michael named a figure that made even his unflappable business manager blink. "That's substantial," Tristan said finally. "It needs to be. This isn't about charity, Tristan. It's about fixing something that's broken. Teachers shouldn't end up counting pennies after spending decades shaping young minds." "I agree completely. But this will take time to set up properly. Then we'd better get started." Michael pulled out his phone and showed Tristan pictures he'd taken of Mrs. Winters' apartment building. "Meanwhile, I want Mrs. Winters in a better place immediately. Start looking for a suitable house today." Tristan made more notes. "What about her pride? From what you've told me, she may not accept such help easily." Michael had thought about this too. "We'll set it up through a teacher support program. Make it seem like she qualified based on her years of service. She doesn't need to know it's coming from me personally." "Very thoughtful," Tristan nodded. "And the larger foundation? Keep it completely secret for now. No press releases, no announcements. I want everything in place before we go public." As they continued planning, Michael felt a growing excitement. This was different from building a new shoe line or opening a restaurant. This was about giving back in a way that honored someone who had helped shape his life. By the time they finished breakfast, they had outlined the first steps of what Michael was now calling the secret plan. Tristan would begin house hunting that afternoon. Michael would return to Chicago the next day to start assembling their team of experts. "One more thing," Michael said as they were about to leave. "I want someone to check in on Mrs. Winters regularly while we get this set up. Someone friendly who can help with groceries, drive her to appointments if needed, that sort of thing." "I can hire a home health aide," Tristan suggested. Michael shook his head. "No, she'd see through that. It needs to be more natural." "My assistant, Daria Chen, is from Wilmington," Tristan said. "She's visiting family here this week. Perhaps she could stop by as a volunteer from a community program for seniors?" "Perfect," Michael said. "Make sure she's well compensated. But Mrs. Winters can't know she's connected to me." As they left the restaurant, Michael felt lighter than he had in years. Basketball had given him fame and fortune. Business had given him continued success and wealth. But this felt different. This felt right in a way nothing had for a long time. Back in his room, Michael called Mrs. Winters. "I wanted to let you know I'm heading back to Chicago tomorrow," he said when she answered. "Oh, it was so lovely to see you," she said warmly. "Don't be a stranger next time you're in town." "I won't," he promised. "And a community volunteer might stop by to check on you occasionally. Her name is Daria. The city has a new program for seniors living alone." "That's not necessary," Mrs. Winters began. "Just give her a chance," Michael interrupted gently. "She's new and needs the experience." After a pause, Mrs. Winters chuckled. "Always the charmer, Michael. All right, I'll be nice to your Daria." After they hung up, Michael stood at the window, looking out at Wilmington. The plan was in motion. For Mrs. Winters, things would start getting better immediately. For thousands of other teachers, help would take longer to arrive. But it was coming. Michael smiled to himself. Mrs. Winters had been right all those years ago. He had done well in basketball, but maybe this would be his greatest achievement yet. The next morning, Michael flew back to Chicago on his private jet. Usually, he used flight time to catch up on sleep or watch game footage, but today he was wide awake, reading reports Tristan had prepared about teacher pensions across America. The more he read, the more troubled he became. The average teacher pension in many states was less than $30,000 a year, barely above the poverty line. Some retired teachers received even less. And unlike most workers, many teachers in certain states weren't eligible for Social Security benefits, even if they had paid into the system earlier in their careers. "This is worse than I thought," Michael muttered to himself, flipping through page after page of statistics and charts. By the time his plane landed in Chicago, Michael had a clearer picture of the problem, and it was bigger than he had imagined. This wasn't just about a few unlucky teachers who had fallen through the cracks. It was about an entire profession that was undervalued and underpaid, with retirement systems that left too many educators struggling in their golden years. Tactor. At his office, Michael canceled his afternoon meetings and called in his senior team. "I need everything we can find on teacher retirement benefits," he told them. State-by-state breakdowns, historical data, expert opinions, everything. His team exchanged confused glances. This was far outside their normal business concerns. "This for a new investment strategy?" one of them asked. "No," Michael replied. "It's for something more important." Over the next week, Michael immersed himself in research. He read academic papers, government reports, and news articles. He spoke with economists, education experts, and retirement specialists. The more he learned, the more passionate he became about addressing the issue. Tristan called with updates from Wilmington. He had found a beautiful one-story house for Mrs. Winters, close to her church and within walking distance of a small park. The sale was moving forward through a shell company to keep Michael's involvement hidden. Meanwhile, Daria Chen had introduced herself to Mrs. Winters as a community volunteer. According to Tristan, the two had hit it off immediately. Daria was helping with groceries and had even fixed Mrs. Winters' leaky sink. She wanted to pay Daria for the plumbing work, Tristan reported. Daria had to pretend the volunteer program covered it. Michael smiled at this. Mrs. Winters' pride and independence remained intact, just as he had hoped. 10 days after his return to Chicago, Michael arranged a meeting with the National Education Association. He didn't reveal his full intentions, but presented himself as a concerned citizen interested in teacher welfare. The NEA representatives were initially skeptical about why a basketball superstar turned businessman wanted to discuss teacher pensions. But as Michael shared what he had learned and asked thoughtful questions, their wariness faded. "The truth is," said Vanessa Rodriguez, a senior NEA policy advisor, "many Americans have no idea how poorly our education system treats retired teachers. Some states haven't increased pension payments in decades, despite rising costs of living. Healthcare coverage is often inadequate, and because many teachers don't participate in Social Security, they have no safety net beyond their pensions." "What about teachers' unions?" Michael asked. "Aren't they fighting for better retirement benefits?" "We try," Vanessa sighed, "but public opinion often works against us. When people hear teacher pensions, they think we're asking for special treatment. They don't understand that for many teachers, these pensions are their only source of retirement income." Michael left the meeting with a clearer understanding of the political and social obstacles facing any effort to improve teacher retirement benefits. This wouldn't be as simple as writing checks. It would require advocacy, education, and systemic change. Back at his office, Michael found Tristan waiting with more news from Wilmington. "The house purchase is complete," Tristan reported. "Renovations will begin tomorrow to make it fully accessible for Mrs. Winters. We're adding grab bars in the bathroom, a ramp at the entrance, and updating the kitchen for easier use." "Perfect," Michael nodded. "How soon can she move in?" 2 weeks, if the renovations stay on schedule." "And the trust fund?" "Set up and funded," Tristan confirmed. "It will cover her living expenses, health care costs, home maintenance, and provide a generous monthly allowance. All delivered through what appears to be a teacher legacy program that she qualified for." "Good work," Michael said. "Now we need to think about the bigger picture." He led Tristan to a conference room where the walls were covered with charts, statistics, and news clippings about teacher retirement issues. Maps showed pension amounts by state, with alarming variations. Graphs displayed the declining purchasing power of fixed pension payments over time. Tristan whistled softly as he took it all in. "You've been busy." "This isn't just about Mrs. Winters anymore," Michael said, gesturing to the wall of information. "Did you know that in some states, teachers who've worked for 30 years receive less than $20,000 a year in pension? Or that many have to choose between medicine and food, just like Mrs. Winters?" Tristan shook his head. "I had no idea it was this bad." "Neither did I," Michael said grimly. "But now we do, and we're going to do something about it." He pointed to a photo of Mrs. Winters that he had placed at the center of the display. "She's just the beginning." The next morning, Michael called a meeting with his most trusted advisors. He had never been one to do things halfway, whether on the basketball court or in business. This new project would be no different. I need the best people, he told Tristan. Not just the usual legal and financial experts, but people who understand education, retirement policy, and advocacy. Tristan nodded, making notes. Any specific names in mind? Michael slid a folder across the desk. Start with these. Inside was a list of names he had researched himself. Education policy experts, pension specialists, marketing professionals who had experience with social causes, and, surprisingly, several former NBA players who had gone on to successful business careers. Why these basketball players? Tristan asked, scanning the list. Because they understand teamwork, Michael explained. And most of them had teachers who believed in them, just like I did. Plus, their names will get attention when we go public. Over the next 2 weeks, Michael personally contacted each person on his list. Some were skeptical at first, wondering why Michael Jordan was suddenly interested in teacher pensions. Others were immediately enthusiastic, having seen firsthand the struggles retired educators faced. Linda Ramirez, a leading education policy expert from Stanford University, was the first to join what Michael was now calling his dream team. When Michael Jordan calls and says he wants to help teachers, you don't say no, she told Tristan during her onboarding. Besides, this issue has needed a champion with real influence for decades. Next came Marcus Williams, a former NBA rival turned successful investment banker. Their on-court battles had been legendary, but when Michael explained his vision, Marcus set aside old rivalries immediately. My mother was a teacher for 35 years, Marcus revealed during their call. She lives with me now because her pension barely covers her medications. I'm in, Jordan, all the way in. Slowly but surely, the team took shape. Financial experts, legal advisors, marketing specialists, education advocates, each bringing unique skills and perspectives to the table. Michael insisted that every team member sign strict confidentiality agreements. We're not going public until we're ready, he explained during their first group meeting. No leaks, no hints, no social media posts. While the dream team began their work in Chicago, Daria Chen kept Michael updated on Mrs. Winters in Wilmington. The house renovations were progressing well. Mrs. Winters still had no idea that her life was about to change dramatically. She showed me old photo albums yesterday, Daria reported during one of their regular calls. There were so many pictures of you, Mr. Jordan. Newspaper clippings, team photos, even a birthday card you made for her in 4th grade. She kept that? Michael asked, surprised and touched. She kept everything, Daria confirmed. She told me you were special, even before you became famous. Said you had heart and determination that couldn't be taught. These stories only strengthened Michael's resolve. The Dream Team was now meeting 3 times a week, developing a comprehensive plan for what they were calling the Second Bell Foundation, named after the school bell that signals the end of the day. The foundation would have 2 main objectives: providing immediate assistance to retired teachers in financial need, and advocating for systemic changes to teacher retirement systems nationwide. Michael was hands-on with every aspect of the planning. He attended every meeting, asked tough questions, and pushed for bold solutions. This wasn't just another business venture or charitable donation. This was personal. We need to think big, he told the team during a strategy session. I don't want to just help a few hundred teachers. I want to change how this country treats its educators. Marcus Williams nodded in agreement. If we're going to do this, let's do it right. Go big or go home, right, MJ? The room chuckled at the basketball reference, but the sentiment was serious. They were all in on creating something transformative. As the foundation plans developed, Michael occasionally reached out to other celebrity friends and business contacts, carefully feeling out who might support such an initiative without revealing the full scope of what he was planning. "I might have a project coming up," he would say casually. "Something about supporting teachers. Would that interest you?" The responses were overwhelmingly positive. Actors, musicians, tech billionaires, many had their own stories about teachers who had changed their lives. They were eager to help once Michael was ready to share details. Meanwhile, in Wilmington, the house for Mrs. Winters was nearly ready. Fresh paint, new appliances, accessible features throughout, and a garden filled with the roses she had once mentioned loving. Every detail had been carefully considered to make it perfect for her. "When do we tell her?" Tristan asked during a progress update. "Let's set up a test run first," Michael decided. "Find 5 other retired teachers in similar situations. Help them quietly through the Teacher Legacy program we created for Mrs. Winters. Let's make sure our system works before we bring her into it." The test cases were selected carefully. A retired science teacher in Denver who had lost his home after a health crisis, a former school librarian in Atlanta living in her car, a retired music teacher in Seattle choosing between heat and medication each month, and 2 elderly sisters in Boston, both former elementary school teachers sharing a studio apartment because neither could afford to live alone on their pensions. Working through anonymous channels, Michael's team provided housing, health care, and financial support to each teacher. The results were immediate and profound. The science teacher cried when he received the keys to his new apartment. The librarian thought it was a scam until a caseworker personally helped her move into a senior living community. The sisters called it a miracle when they were able to move into a 2-bedroom apartment with their dignity intact. "It's working," Linda Ramirez reported, tears in her eyes as she shared the stories with the Dream Team. "We're actually changing lives." Michael nodded, but he wasn't satisfied yet. "5 down," he said quietly. "Thousands to go." The team was silent for a moment, contemplating the enormous task ahead. Then Marcus spoke up. "You know what, Jordan? When you first called me about this, I thought it might be some vanity project, a tax write-off or something to polish your image." Michael raised an eyebrow, and Marcus grinned. "But I was wrong," Marcus continued. "This is real, and it might be the most important thing any of us ever do." Michael looked around the table at the diverse group of experts he had assembled, all united by a common purpose. "We're just getting started," he said. "Mrs. Winters moves into her new home next week. That's when the real work begins." Michael flew to Wilmington the day before Mrs. Winters was scheduled to move into her new house. He wanted to see the finished product himself, to make sure everything was perfect. The house was a single-story craftsman on a quiet street lined with oak trees. Nothing flashy or extravagant. That would have made Mrs. Winters uncomfortable. But solid, charming, and built to last. Michael walked through each room, checking details large and small. The grab bars in the bathroom, the extra-wide doorways to accommodate a walker or wheelchair if needed someday, the kitchen counters lowered slightly for easier access. In the living room, built-in bookshelves waited to be filled with Mrs. Winters's beloved books. The backyard featured raised garden beds that wouldn't require bending or kneeling. Every feature had been carefully chosen with her specific needs in mind. "It's perfect," Michael told Tristan, who had accompanied him on the visit. "She's going to love it." "And she still has no idea?" Tristan asked. "None. Daria told her the community volunteer program is helping her move to a new senior apartment tomorrow. She thinks she's going to another rental." The next morning, Michael waited nervously at the new house while Daria picked up Mrs. Winters. He had decided to be present for this moment. Hiding his involvement was no longer important. When the car pulled into the driveway, Michael stepped onto the front porch. Through the windshield, He could see Mrs. Winters's confused expression as she looked at the house, then at Daria. "There must be some mistake," he heard her say, as Daria helped her from the car. "This isn't an apartment building." "No mistake, Mrs. Winters," Daria said with a smile. "This is your new home." Mrs. Winters looked bewildered until she spotted Michael on the porch. She stopped in her tracks. "Michael? What's going on?" He walked down to meet her, taking her frail hand in his. "Welcome home, Mrs. Winters." Her eyes filled with tears as understanding dawned. "You did this? But I can't possibly." "You can," Michael said firmly. "Through a special program for teachers who've given their lives to educating others. You qualified based on your 40 years of service." It wasn't entirely a lie. The program existed now, created specifically for her and others like her. But Michael knew Mrs. Winters would refuse anything that felt like charity. "But how?" she asked, looking at the beautiful house in disbelief. "Let's go inside," Michael suggested. "I'll explain everything." Over the next hour, Michael and Daria showed Mrs. Winters through her new home. They explained about the Teacher Legacy Program, how it provided housing and financial support to retired educators who had dedicated their lives to teaching. They showed her the trust fund paperwork, with Michael's name carefully removed, that would cover her expenses for the rest of her life. Mrs. Winters moved from room to room in stunned silence, touching furniture, looking out windows, opening and closing cabinets. When they reached the master bedroom, she found her clothes already hanging in the closet, her photos arranged on the dresser. "My books?" she asked in a small voice. "All being delivered this afternoon," Daria assured her. "Every single one." Mrs. Winters sat down suddenly on the edge of the bed, overwhelmed. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Michael told her. "Just enjoy it. You've earned it." Later, as Michael prepared to leave, Mrs. Winters pulled him aside. "This isn't just the program, is it?" she asked quietly. "This is you." Michael hesitated, then nodded. "The program is real. But yes, I helped get it started. For you and for other teachers who deserve better." She squeezed his hand tightly. "I don't know how to thank you." "You already did," Michael said. "Every day you showed up to teach. Every time you stayed late to help a struggling student. Every word of encouragement when someone needed it most." After saying goodbye to Mrs. Winters, Michael flew back to Chicago feeling a sense of accomplishment unlike anything he'd experienced since his playing days. Helping Mrs. Winters had been deeply satisfying, but, as his team had discovered through their research, there were thousands more like her. The 5 test cases had proven their model could work. Now it was time to scale up. But challenges quickly emerged. Identifying teachers in need proved difficult, as many were too proud to ask for help. Creating a system that preserved their dignity while providing real support required constant refinement. And the sheer number of retired educators facing financial hardship was staggering. Michael found himself increasingly absorbed in the project, sometimes missing important business meetings to work on foundation issues. His longtime business partners began to worry. This wasn't the Michael Jordan they knew, the laser-focused businessman who never let anything distract him from the bottom line. "What's going on with you?" one partner demanded, after Michael missed a key investment meeting. "Is everything okay?" Michael just smiled. "Everything's better than okay. I've just got my eye on a different kind of prize these days." 3 months. After Mrs. Winters moved into her new home, the Second Bell Foundation was gaining momentum behind the scenes. Michael's dream team had expanded to include specialists in elder care, housing experts, and retired school administrators who understood the system from the inside. But with growth came complications. During a tense meeting in Michael's Chicago UTY office, the legal team presented a troubling report. The tax implications are more complex than we anticipated, explained Javier Gutierrez, the foundation's lead attorney. Setting up a private foundation of this size triggers all kinds of IRS scrutiny. So we deal with the scrutiny, Michael shrugged. We're not doing anything wrong. It's not just taxes, Linda Ramirez added. Some states have laws that could actually prevent retired teachers from accepting our help. If they receive additional income above a certain threshold, they could lose their pensions entirely. That's insane, Michael said, his frustration evident. We're trying to help them, not hurt them. Welcome to the broken system we're trying to fix, Linda replied grimly. As the meeting continued, more obstacles emerged. Housing trust laws varied, from state to state. Healthcare coverage complications could arise if they provided supplemental insurance. Even identifying teachers in need without violating privacy laws presented challenges. Maybe we need to scale back, suggested one financial advisor. Focus on a single state first. Work out the kinks before expanding. Michael shook his head firmly. We're not scaling back. We find solutions. But privately, the growing complications weighed on him. What had seemed straightforward, helping teachers like Mrs. Winters, was becoming a maze of legal, financial, and logistical challenges. Adding to his concerns were rumblings from potential donors. While many embraced the cause immediately, others questioned whether teachers deserved special treatment. Why teachers and not firefighters? Asked one billionaire tech founder when Michael approached him for support. Or veterans? Or nurses? Everyone thinks their group should be first in line. The question bothered Michael more than he wanted to admit. Was he letting his personal connection to Mrs. Winters cloud his judgment? Should the foundation have a broader focus? During a particularly difficult meeting with tax attorneys, Michael nearly lost his temper when they suggested complex offshore structures to maximize tax benefits. That's not what this is about, he snapped. We're not trying to game the system. We're trying to help people who dedicated their lives to helping others. That evening, frustrated and doubting his approach, Michael flew to Wilmington. He hadn't told anyone he was coming, not even Daria. He needed to see Mrs. Winters, to remind himself why he had started this journey. When he arrived at her house, she was sitting on the front porch in a rocking chair, reading a book in the fading light. She looked up in surprise as his car pulled into the driveway. Michael! What a wonderful surprise! The strain must have shown on his face, because her smile quickly turned to concern. What's wrong, dear? You look troubled. They sat together on the porch as the sun set. Without revealing too many details, Michael shared some of the challenges he was facing with expanding the teacher program. Mrs. Winters listened quietly, nodding occasionally. When he finished, she was silent for a moment before speaking. Do you remember when you were struggling with fractions in 4th grade? She asked. Michael smiled despite himself. You stayed after school with me for weeks. And you got frustrated. You wanted to give up? Do you remember what I told you? Patience. Michael, he recited from memory. Some things take time to get right. Mrs. Winters nodded. Some of the most important things in life are also the most difficult. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do them. As Michael drove back to his hotel that night, Mrs. Winters's words echoed in his mind. She was right, of course. He had never backed. Down from a challenge on the basketball court. Why start now? His resolve renewed, Michael called Tristan. Schedule an emergency meeting of the full team for tomorrow morning, he said. We've got work to do. The next few weeks saw renewed energy in the Second Bell Foundation. Michael's team tackled each obstacle with fresh determination, finding creative solutions to the complex problems they faced. Legal experts developed state-specific approaches to navigate varying pension laws. Financial advisors created flexible support systems that wouldn't endanger recipients' existing benefits. The foundation was gaining momentum again. By now, they had quietly helped 23 retired teachers across 5 states. Each success story strengthened Michael's conviction that they were on the right path. The foundation was still operating, in complete secrecy, with no public announcements or media coverage. Michael wanted everything perfect before going public. Then disaster struck. Emma Park, a junior staff member who had been hired just weeks earlier, accidentally sent foundation documents to a reporter instead of to the legal team. She had mixed up email addresses, a simple human error with devastating consequences. The reporter, recognizing Michael Jordan's name throughout the documents, immediately began investigating. Within days, headlines appeared across the country. Michael Jordan's secret project. What is the basketball legend hiding? Sources reveal Jordan's mysterious new venture, MJ's teacher, charity, genuine concern, or tax shelter. The last headline infuriated Michael the most. Some financial blogs were suggesting the foundation was just a clever tax write-off, a way for a billionaire to shield his wealth while polishing his public image. How dare they? Michael fumed, pacing his office as Tristan showed him the latest articles. They don't know anything about what we're trying to do. We should issue a statement, Tristan suggested. Get ahead of the story. No, Michael insisted. We're not ready to go public. We haven't worked out all the details yet. But the media frenzy continued to build. Reporters began tracking down people connected to the foundation, including some of the teachers they had helped. Most refused to comment, loyal to the program that had changed their lives. But a few, uncomfortable with the sudden attention, expressed concern about being used for publicity. Then came the call Michael had been dreading. Mrs. Winters's name appeared on his phone screen late one evening. Michael? Her voice sounded small and uncertain. I've been getting calls from reporters. They're saying strange things about you and the Teacher Legacy program. Michael's heart sank. What kind of things? They're saying it's all for show, that you're using people like me to make yourself look good. She paused. One reporter even suggested my house isn't really mine, that it could be taken away when you're done with your publicity stunt. None of that is true, Michael said, firmly. You know that, right? There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Mrs. Winters? I thought I knew, she said finally. But Michael, I don't want to be anyone's good deed. I don't want my story used to make someone else look charitable, even you. That's not what this is, Michael insisted, but he could hear the doubt in her voice. Maybe you should stop calling for a while, she suggested quietly, until this dies down. The call ended with awkward goodbyes, leaving Michael feeling hollow. He had started this entire project to help Mrs. Winters, and now she felt used and exposed. That night, alone in his home office, surrounded by basketball, trophies, and business awards, Michael questioned everything. Had he made a terrible mistake? Was he making things worse for the very people he wanted to help? Should he shut down the foundation before it caused more harm than good? He picked up a framed photo from his desk, the same classroom picture that Mrs. Winters had kept all these years, showing him as a gangly fourth grader with a bright smile. In that moment, Michael felt further from that innocent, hopeful boy than ever before. The next morning, Emma Park, the staff member who had accidentally leaked the documents, came to his office in tears, expecting to be fired. I'm so sorry. Mr. Jordan, she sobbed. I never meant to. It's okay, Michael interrupted, surprising himself with his calm tone. Mistakes happen. You're not firing me? Michael shook his head. No, but I need you to tell me something honestly. He leaned forward. Do you believe in what we're trying to do here? Or is this just another job to you? Emma wiped her eyes. My grandmother was a teacher for 37 years, she said. When she retired, she had to keep working as a cashier until she was almost 80. So, yes, sir. I believe in this more than anything I've ever done. Her sincerity struck Michael deeply. Here was someone who understood personally what was at stake. Maybe what the foundation needed wasn't more secrecy, but more voices like Emma's, people who could speak authentically about the need they were addressing. For the first time since the leak, Michael began to see a path forward. It wouldn't be the path he had planned, but perhaps it could be something better. That night, Michael couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned, replaying his conversation with Mrs. Winters and Emma's tearful confession. Around 2 a.m., his phone rang. The caller ID showed Coach Jackson, his former coach with the Chicago Bulls. Coach? Michael answered, surprised. It's the middle of the night. I just saw the news about your teacher foundation, Coach Jackson said without preamble. Figured you might be awake. Michael sighed. It's all falling apart, Coach. The media's twisting everything. Mrs. Winters thinks I'm using her. I'm not. Sure, I can fix this. Sounds familiar, Coach Jackson said calmly. Remember Game 5 against Utah? Down by 3 with 10 seconds left? Everyone thought we were finished. Despite his mood, Michael smiled at the memory. We won that game. Because you never gave up, Coach Jackson replied. That's always been your greatest strength, Michael. Not your jump shot or your defense. Your refusal to accept defeat. After they hung up, Michael stood at his window, watching the Chicago skyline glitter in the darkness. Coach Jackson was right. He had never been one to back down from a challenge. Why start now? By morning, Michael had made a decision. The foundation's approach needed to change. No more secrecy, no more working in the shadows. It was time to bring everything into the light. Call an emergency meeting, he told Tristan. And I want Mrs. Winters there. Mrs. Winters? Are you sure that's— I'm sure, Michael said firmly. And find 4 other retired teachers from our program who might be willing to speak with us. This isn't about doing something for teachers anymore. It's about doing something with them. 2 days later, Michael sat at the head of a conference table in a Wilmington hotel meeting room. Beside him were Mrs. Winters and 4 other retired teachers from the Foundation's pilot program. Mr. Chen, who had taught high school physics for 35 years. Mrs. Rodriguez, a former kindergarten teacher. Mr. Patterson, who had spent his career teaching music to middle schoolers. And Ms. Taylor, who had been a school librarian for 4 decades. Across from them sat key members of the Dream Team: Linda Ramirez, Marcus Williams, Javier Gutierrez, and Emma Park. Tristan stood by a whiteboard, ready to take notes. Thank you all for coming, Michael began. Especially you, Mrs. Winters. I know our last conversation was difficult. Mrs. Winters nodded, but didn't speak. Her expression was guarded. I owe you all an apology, Michael continued, addressing the EEEP teachers. I started this foundation because I wanted to help people like you, dedicated educators who deserve better in retirement, but I've been making a critical mistake. He looked directly at Mrs. Winters. I've been treating you as recipients of charity rather than partners in a mission. That ends today. For the next hour, Michael shared his complete vision for the second Bell Foundation, not just the immediate assistance program, but the long-term advocacy goals. the policy changes they hoped to achieve, the cultural shift they wanted to create in how America valued its teachers. When he finished, the room was silent. Then Mrs. Winters spoke. "Why didn't you tell me all this from the beginning, Michael?" "I was trying to protect your pride," he admitted. "I didn't want you to feel like a charity case." Mrs. Winters shook her head slowly. "That wasn't your decision to make. You should have trusted me with the truth." "You're right," Michael acknowledged. "I should have." Mr. Chen leaned forward. "What exactly are you asking of us now?" "I'm asking for your partnership," Michael replied. "Your wisdom, your perspective. This foundation shouldn't be run by financial experts and celebrities. It should be guided by the very people it aims to serve, teachers." Ms. Taylor, the librarian, adjusted her glasses. "You want us to help design the program?" "Not just design it," Michael said. "Help run it. Join our board of directors. Be the public face of this initiative, if you're willing." The 5 retired teachers exchanged glances, a mixture of surprise and interest on their faces. "Why would you want us?" Mrs. Rodriguez asked. "We don't know anything about running foundations." "But you know everything about being teachers," Michael countered. "About the challenges you faced during your careers and in retirement. About what would actually help, not just what looks good on paper." Mrs. Winters studied Michael thoughtfully. "You're serious about this?" "Completely serious," he confirmed. "The foundation still needs financial backing and legal expertise, but it needs teacher wisdom even more." For the next several hours, the meeting transformed into a collaborative working session. The teachers began sharing ideas based on their own experiences, insights that the Dream Team's research had missed entirely. Mr. Patterson pointed out that many teachers struggled with technology in retirement, making it hard for them to access benefits online. Ms. Taylor emphasized the isolation many retired teachers faced after leaving school communities that had been their social circles for decades. Mrs. Rodriguez suggested partnering with teacher training programs to create mentorship opportunities that would value retired teachers' expertise while keeping them connected to their profession. As Michael listened, he realized how much richer and more effective the foundation could be with teacher involvement. The ideas flowing around the table weren't just good, they were transformative. By late afternoon, the initial tension had dissolved. Even Mrs. Winters was engaged, suggesting ways to identify teachers in need without compromising their dignity. "What if we worked through the teachers' associations?" she proposed. "They already know who's struggling, and hearing about help from a trusted source would make it easier to accept." Linda Ramirez, the education policy expert, looked at Michael with newfound respect. "This is exactly what the foundation needed," she whispered. "Real teacher input." As the meeting wrapped up, Michael addressed the group one final time. "Today has been a turning point," he said. "Not just for the foundation, but for me personally. I started this thinking I had all the answers because I had the resources. I was wrong. This was never about a wealthy ex-athlete helping poor teachers. It's about all of us working together to fix a broken system." He looked at Mrs. Winters. "What do you say? Will you help us build something that truly honors teachers' contributions?" Mrs. Winters smiled for the first time since she'd arrived. "Well, Michael, I always did say you had potential beyond basketball." The room erupted in laughter, breaking the last of the tension. Even Michael chuckled, relieved to see glimpses of the Mrs. Winters he remembered. Wise, kind, and never afraid to speak her mind. Over the next few weeks, the Second Bell Foundation underwent a complete transformation. The 5 retired teachers became the heart of the initiative, meeting regularly with Michael's team to reshape every aspect of the program. Under Mrs. Winters' guidance, they developed a teacher-to-teacher approach. Instead of foundation staff, Identifying educators in need, they would work through existing teacher networks and associations. This preserved dignity while ensuring help reached those who needed it most. Teachers trust other teachers, Mrs. Winters explained during one planning session. We'll be more likely to accept help if it comes from someone who understands our journey. The foundation structure changed too. What had started as a top-down charity became a true partnership between Michael's business expertise and the teacher's lived experience. Half the board seats would be filled by retired educators, ensuring their voices guided every decision. As the foundation took its new shape, Michael began quietly reaching out to other athletes, celebrities, and business leaders. His approach was different now, more transparent, more passionate, more personal. "Remember that teacher who believed in you when no one else did?" he would ask. "The one who stayed late to help you understand algebra or encouraged your writing? There are thousands of them living in poverty right now after decades of service." The response was overwhelming. Former NBA teammates immediately pledged support. Actors, musicians, and tech billionaires signed on as founding donors. Many shared their own stories of teachers who had changed their lives. "My third-grade teacher paid for my first guitar out of her own pocket," a famous musician told Michael. "I wouldn't have a career without her. Count me in." Perhaps most surprising was the support from Michael's former rivals on the basketball court. Players he had battled fiercely during his career now stood shoulder to shoulder with him in this new arena. "You beat me in the finals twice," one NBA legend said with a laugh. "But I'll forgive you if you let me help with this teacher thing. My mom taught elementary school for 30 years. Marcus Williams, the former rival on Michael's dream team, took a particularly active role. He reached out to financial institutions, securing commitments for special mortgage programs and retirement planning services for teachers. "We're building something historic here," Marcus told Michael after a particularly successful meeting with bank executives. "Bigger than championships." Behind the scenes, the Second Bell's pilot program continued to expand. Working through teacher associations and retirement groups, they identified educators in desperate situations and provided immediate relief. Housing, health care, financial support, all delivered with dignity and respect. Each success strengthened Michael's resolve. The science teacher in Denver who could finally afford his heart medication, the retired art teacher in Miami who no longer had to choose between paying rent or buying groceries, the elderly English teacher in Seattle who wept with joy when told she could move out of her daughter's garage and into her own apartment. "These aren't just statistics," Michael reminded his team during their weekly updates. "These are lives we're changing. Real people who spent decades changing other lives." The media coverage, which had begun so negatively, started to shift as word leaked out about what the Second Bell was actually doing. Reporters began telling the stories of teachers helped by the program. Op-eds appeared questioning why America allowed its educators to struggle in retirement after dedicating their lives to children. Mrs. Winters emerged as a powerful spokesperson. Initially reluctant to step into the spotlight, she found her voice as an advocate for teacher dignity. She gave interviews to carefully selected journalists, painting a vivid picture of the challenges retired educators faced. "We're not asking for mansions or luxury cars," she told one national news program, "just the security to age with dignity after a lifetime of service." Her composed, articulate presence put a human face on the issue, making it harder for critics to dismiss the foundation as a celebrity vanity project. As launch day approached, preparation intensified. The foundation had secured commitments totaling over $50 million from initial donors. They had created partnerships with housing providers, healthcare systems, and financial institutions. They had established chapters in 15 states, with plans for nationwide expansion within 5 years. Most importantly, they had developed a two-pronged approach to the issue: immediate relief for retired educators in crisis and long-term advocacy for systemic changes to teacher compensation and retirement benefits. Today's emergency support is essential, Mrs. Winters often reminded the team, but tomorrow's policies are what will truly solve this problem. The night before the official launch, Michael hosted a dinner at his Chicago home for the core team. Mrs. Winters sat at his right, while Tristan, Linda, Marcus, and the other retired teachers filled the large dining table. "I want to thank all of you," Michael said, raising his glass. "6 months ago, this was just an idea. A reaction to finding Mrs. Winters in circumstances no dedicated teacher should ever face." He looked around the table, his gaze lingering on Mrs. Winters. "Tomorrow, we go public. The world will know what we're doing and why it matters. There will be attention, some good, some bad. There will be challenges we haven't anticipated. But there's no group I'd rather face those challenges with than the people in this room." Mrs. Rodriguez, the kindergarten teacher, spoke up. "When I was teaching 5-year-olds, I always said the most important lesson was learning to share." She smiled at Michael. "Thank you for sharing your resources, your platform, and your determination with us." Mr. Chen raised his glass. "And thank you for listening when we said your first approach needed work. Not everyone with your success would have the humility to change course." Michael shook his head. "The humility is all mine. I've won championships and built businesses. But this foundation, what we're building together, might be the most important work of my life." As the evening wound down, Mrs. Winters pulled Michael aside. "I've been meaning to ask you something," she said quietly. "Why did you name it The Second Bell?" Michael smiled. "Do you remember what you used to say at the end of each school day?" Mrs. Winters thought for a moment, then her eyes lit up with recognition. "The second bell doesn't mean the end of learning," she recited. "It just means you're taking it with you into the world." "Exactly," Michael nodded. "The second bell of a teacher's career shouldn't mean the end of their dignity or security. It should mean they carry their legacy of service into a retirement of respect." Mrs. Winters squeezed his hand, her eyes bright with tears. "You really did listen in my class, didn't you?" "To every word," Michael assured her. "And tomorrow, the world starts listening too." The morning of the launch day dawned bright and clear. Michael woke early, feeling a familiar flutter of pre-game nerves. But this wasn't a championship game. The stakes felt even higher. Tristan had arranged for the official announcement to take place at Ogden Elementary School, where Michael had been a student and where Mrs. Winters had taught for many years. The old building had been renovated, but still stood at the heart of the community, serving new generations of children. "Perfect symbolism," Mrs. Winters had said when Michael suggested the location, where it all began. The school gymnasium had been transformed overnight. A small stage stood at one end with chairs arranged for the speakers: Michael, Mrs. Winters, and the other teacher advisors. Seating for media and invited guests filled the rest of the space. Outside, satellite trucks lined the street as reporters from across the country gathered, still speculating about what Michael Jordan's big announcement would be. Michael arrived early to walk through the space. The basketball hoops were still there, pulled up toward the ceiling to make room for the event. He couldn't help but smile, remembering how many hours he had spent in school gyms just like this one, dreaming of becoming a basketball star. "Feeling nostalgic?" Tristan asked, appearing beside him with a clipboard. "A little," Michael admitted. "I've come full circle in some ways." "The teachers are in the library getting ready," Tristan reported. "Mrs. Winters asked if you could join them before things start." Michael found the teacher advisors gathered. In the school library, each looking nervous but determined in their newly tailored outfits. A gift from Michael to ensure they felt comfortable in the spotlight. Mrs. Winters was helping Mr. Patterson straighten his tie. Miss Taylor was rehearsing her brief remarks under her breath. Mrs. Rodriguez was flipping through a photo album of her teaching days, while Mr. Chen paced by the bookshelves. "Good morning," Michael said, entering the room. They all turned, smiles brightening their faces despite their nerves. "There he is," Mrs. Winters said warmly. "The man who started it all." "No," Michael corrected gently. "You started it, Mrs. Winters. You and every teacher who gave their best to their students without thinking about themselves." For the next half hour, they reviewed the plan for the announcement. The Foundation's work had already helped dozens of teachers through its soft launch. These educators had been invited to the ceremony, but given the option to remain anonymous. "How many are coming?" Michael asked Tristan. "Almost all of them," Tristan replied, checking his tablet. "And most have chosen to attend openly. They're proud to be part of this." "As they should be," Mrs. Winters nodded. "There's no shame in receiving help you've earned through a lifetime of service." At 10 o'clock, guests began arriving at the school. Local officials, education advocates, representatives from teachers' associations, and most importantly, teachers, current and retired, from across the state and beyond. Among them were the very first recipients of the Second Bell's assistance, the science teacher from Denver, the librarian from Atlanta, the music teacher from Seattle, and the teacher sisters from Boston. All had flown in at the Foundation's expense to be part of this historic day. Behind the scenes, Michael gathered with his core team for final preparations. Linda Ramirez reviewed key talking points. Marcus Williams confirmed that major donors were in place. Tristan checked that all technological aspects were functioning properly. "Media has been told only that you're making an important announcement about education," Tristan reported. "No details have leaked about the full scope of the Foundation." Michael nodded, taking a deep breath. "Then let's surprise them all." As the time approached, Michael felt a hand on his arm. It was Mrs. Winters. "Nervous?" she asked with a knowing smile. "A little," he admitted. "Different kind of pressure than a championship game." "You'll do fine," she assured him. "Just speak from the heart, like you did with us." Michael smiled gratefully. "Any other teacher advice before we go out there?" Mrs. Winters thought for a moment. "Remember why we're doing this. Not for recognition or praise, but because it's right. Because every teacher deserves dignity in retirement after shaping so many young lives, including mine," Michael added softly. The gymnasium was now filled to capacity. Through the doors, Michael could hear the buzz of anticipation. In 5 minutes, they would walk onto that stage and announce the Second Bell Foundation to the world. Looking around at the diverse team he had assembled, financial experts and retired educators, marketing professionals and former basketball rivals, Michael felt a sense of pride, unlike anything he had experienced before. This wasn't about winning a trophy or closing a business deal. This was about changing lives, about honoring those who had given so much to others. "It's time," Tristan said, checking his watch. Michael offered his arm to Mrs. Winters. "Ready to make history, Mrs. Winters?" She took his arm with a smile. "I taught history for 40 years, Michael. It's about time I made some." Together, they walked into the packed gymnasium. Camera flashes erupted as Michael Jordan stepped onto the stage, followed by Mrs. Winters and the other teacher advisors. The crowd hushed in anticipation. The school principal made a brief introduction, her voice filled with pride that her school had been chosen for this mysterious announcement. Then it was Michael's turn to speak. He approached the microphone, scanning the sea of faces. Reporters with notepads and cameras, local officials in their Sunday best, teachers, so many teachers, looking up at him with curious expressions. "Good morning," Michael began. "Thank you all for coming today. Many of you are wondering why I've asked you here, especially to this particular school." He gestured around. "The gymnasium. I spent a lot of time in this gym as a kid. Shot my first basket on these hoops. Learned about teamwork on this floor. But the most important lessons I learned at Ogden Elementary didn't happen in the gym. They happened in the classroom." Michael turned toward Mrs. Winters, who sat with perfect posture in her chair. "Mrs. Eleanor Winters taught me 4th grade, in this building. She taught me fractions and geography and grammar. But she also taught me about determination, about dignity, about never giving up when things get hard." The crowd was silent now, hanging on his every word. "A few months ago, I ran into Mrs. Winters by chance. But I didn't find her living the comfortable retirement she deserved after 40 years of dedicated teaching. I found her struggling to make ends meet, sometimes choosing between medicine and groceries." Murmurs spread through the audience. Mrs. Winters kept her head high, allowing her story to be told without shame. "That day changed my life," Michael continued. "It opened my eyes to a crisis happening all across America. Thousands of retired teachers, people who shaped our minds and futures, are living in poverty after decades of service." He paused, letting the reality sink in. "Today, I'm announcing the launch of the Second Bell Foundation. Our mission is twofold: to provide immediate support to retired educators in financial need and to advocate for systemic changes to ensure no teacher faces poverty after a lifetime of service." Michael explained the Foundation's approach: the teacher-led board, the dignity-preserving assistance programs, the policy advocacy work. As he spoke, slides appeared on the screen behind him, showing statistics on teacher retirement across the country. "But this foundation isn't just about numbers," Michael said. "It's about people. Teachers who made a difference in countless lives, including mine." He invited Mrs. Winters to join him at the microphone. The elderly teacher rose gracefully and stood beside him. "When I was cut from my high school basketball team, Mrs. Winters told me, 'Failure is not the falling down, Michael. It's the staying down.' Those words changed my life. Today, they're changing lives again, as we refuse to stay down in the face of this challenge." Mrs. Winters spoke briefly, her clear voice carrying through the gymnasium as she explained the reality of teacher retirement with dignity and conviction. When she finished, Michael returned to the microphone for his closing remarks. The Second Bell Foundation launches today with an initial endowment of $50 million, he announced. "But I'm proud to share that this is just the beginning." He paused, looking out at the crowd. "I'm honored to announce that every major sports league in America has committed to this cause. The NBA, NFL, MLB, NHL, and MLS have all pledged their support, creating the largest private initiative for educator support in history." Gasps and applause filled the room as Michael revealed the unprecedented coalition. "Together, we're committing over $1 billion to support retired educators and advocate for lasting change." The gymnasium erupted in a standing ovation. Reporters frantically took notes. Teachers wiped tears from their eyes. As the applause continued, Michael looked at Mrs. Winters, whose composed expression had finally broken into one of genuine astonishment. "Did you know about this?" she whispered. Michael shook his head, smiling. "Some of it just came together yesterday. I wanted it to be a surprise for everyone. Even you." Mrs. Winters squeezed his hand tightly as cameras captured the moment that would soon appear on front pages across the country. By that evening, the Eidifot announcement had gone viral. The second bell was trending worldwide on social media platforms. News channels played clips of Michael's speech on repeat, alongside footage of Mrs. Winters speaking with quiet dignity about the challenges retired teachers faced. Breaking. Michael. Jordan commits billions to teacher support. Read one headline. Sports leagues unite behind Jordan's teacher initiative. Proclaimed another. From jump shots to social justice. Jordan's new legacy, a third announced. But perhaps most powerful were the personal stories flooding the internet. People everywhere began sharing memories of teachers who had changed their lives, mentors who had believed in them, supported them, shaped their futures. My third-grade teacher, Mrs. Davis, bought me glasses when my family couldn't afford them. I wouldn't be a doctor today without her. The second bell. Thank a teacher, wrote one viral post. Mr. Gonzalez stayed after school every day for a month to help me learn English when I moved to this country. Now I'm a professor of literature. The second bell shared another. The Foundation's website, which went live during the announcement, received so much traffic it temporarily crashed. When it came back online, thousands of people had already signed up to volunteer or donate. Back at his hotel suite, Michael watched the coverage with his core team. The reaction was even more powerful than they had anticipated. We've received pledges for an additional $200 million just since this morning, Tristan reported, looking up from his laptop. And they're still coming in. The teacher associations are unanimously supportive, Linda added. They're calling it a watershed moment for educator advocacy. Marcus Williams grinned as he scrolled through his phone. Even my mother called to say she's proud of me, and she's never been impressed by anything I've done before. Mrs. Winters sat quietly on the couch, occasionally shaking her head in wonder as she watched the world respond to a movement that had begun with her story. "Are you okay?" Michael asked her softly. "Just overwhelmed," she admitted. "All these years, I thought no one noticed or cared about what happens to teachers after they leave the classroom. I never imagined something like this." The following morning, requests for interviews flooded in. Everyone wanted to speak with Michael Jordan and Eleanor Winters, the billionaire athlete and the retired teacher who had inspired a movement. After careful consideration, the team accepted a few select opportunities. Michael appeared on a morning news program with Mrs. Winters by his side. Their natural rapport and obvious mutual respect made for compelling television. Mrs. Winters was skeptical of me at first, Michael admitted during the interview, smiling at his former teacher. She thought this might be some kind of publicity stunt. "Can you blame me?" Mrs. Winters replied with a twinkle in her eye. But Michael proved me wrong. He listened to us, really listened, and built something that truly honors teachers' dignity. Organizations that had initially been wary now reached out to partner with the second bell. Teacher pension boards wanted to collaborate. Universities offered research support. Technology companies proposed digital platforms to help identify and assist educators in need. Not all reactions were positive, of course. Some critics questioned whether private philanthropy should be addressing what was essentially a public policy failure. Others suggested the foundation was too focused on teachers, when other professions also faced retirement challenges. "We're not saying teachers are the only ones who deserve better," Michael responded during a press conference. "But they're where we're starting because every successful person had a teacher who helped them along the way." Mrs. Winters handled the skeptics with particular grace. When one commentator suggested teachers knew what they were signing up for with low salaries, she replied calmly, No one signs up to choose between medicine and food after 40 years of service, and a society that forces such choices has forgotten its most basic values. Her appearances on morning shows and news programs turned her into an overnight sensation. Elderly viewers admired her dignity and eloquence. Younger audiences appreciated her gentle but firm advocacy. Teachers everywhere saw themselves in her story. Behind the headlines, the real work continued. Applications for assistance poured in from retired teachers across the country. The Foundation's staff worked around the clock to process requests and provide help. Michael insisted on hearing regular updates about the people they were assisting. Each story strengthened his commitment. The 72-year-old former English teacher who could finally afford the hip replacement she'd been postponing for years. The retired science teacher couple who no longer had to sell their family home to cover medical bills. The 80-year-old former kindergarten teacher who could move out of her son's basement and into her own apartment. 1 week after the announcement, Michael received a call from the White House. The president wanted to meet with him and Mrs. Winters to discuss teacher retirement reform. "The administration is feeling the pressure," Linda explained. "When you have this many people talking about an issue, politicians start paying attention." State legislators began calling too. Some were defensive about their teacher pension systems. Others genuinely wanted to explore solutions. Either way, the conversation had begun. "This is how change happens," Mrs. Winters observed during a team meeting. "First awareness, then outrage, then action." 3 weeks after the launch, Michael and Mrs. Winters were invited to address a joint session of a state legislature considering teacher pension reforms. As they prepared their remarks together in a hotel room, Mrs. Winters paused in her writing. "Did you ever imagine we'd be here when you helped me pick up my groceries that day?" she asked. Michael shook his head. "Never. But I'm grateful every day that I stopped to help." "So am I," Mrs. Winters said softly. "Though I still think you should have been paying more attention in my long division lessons." Michael laughed. Even with all the media attention and public accolades, Mrs. Winters remained exactly who she had always been, his fourth-grade teacher, keeping him humble and focused on what really mattered. 6 months after the launch of the Ibir Second Bell Foundation, Michael stood at the window of its newly established headquarters in Chicago. The office occupied the entire 32nd floor of a downtown building, with views stretching to Lake Michigan. What had begun with a chance encounter now employed a staff of 87 people across the country. Tristan entered with the latest impact report. 1,012, he announced. Michael turned. 1,012? What? Retired. Teachers who now have secure housing, health care, and financial stability because of the second bell, Tristan replied, setting the report on Michael's desk. And applications are still coming in every day. Michael nodded, taking in the number. It was impressive, but still just a fraction of the need they had identified. "What about the policy side?" he asked. "Progress there too," Tristan reported. 3 state legislatures have passed teacher pension reforms. 7 more have bills in committee. And the federal bill to address Social Security penalties for teachers has bipartisan support. These were all victories worth celebrating. Yet, Michael couldn't help feeling that something was still missing. The foundation was doing good work, important work. But lately, it felt more like a well-run organization than the personal mission that had driven him initially. Later that afternoon, Michael flew to Wilmington for a gathering of teachers who had been helped by the foundation. They had organized a small reception at a local community center to thank the foundation and share their stories with each other. As his car pulled up to the venue, Michael spotted Mrs. Winters greeting guests at the door. At 78, she showed no signs of slowing down. If anything, her new role as an advocate for teacher dignity had given her renewed energy and purpose. Inside, about 50 retired teachers mingled, sharing stories and laughter. Some used walkers or canes, others sat in wheelchairs. All had one thing in common: their lives had been transformed by the Foundation's help. Michael moved through the room, listening more than talking. A former high school chemistry teacher described being able to afford her heart medication again. A retired music teacher showed pictures of his grandchildren visiting his new apartment. A couple who had both taught elementary school for over 30 years explained how the Foundation had saved their family home from foreclosure. As he listened, Michael felt the personal connection that had been missing at headquarters. These weren't just statistics in a report. They were real people with lifetimes of service behind them. He spotted Mrs. Winters in conversation with a group of teachers and made his way over. As he approached, he overheard her speaking. "Michael has always been generous," she was saying. "But this isn't about charity. This is about justice." Her words stopped him in his tracks. Justice, not charity. The distinction was subtle, but profound. Throughout the reception, that phrase kept repeating in Michael's mind. As he flew back to Chicago that evening, he couldn't shake Mrs. Winters's words. The Foundation was doing good work, but was it truly addressing the injustice at the core of the problem? At 3 a.m., unable to sleep, Michael called his financial advisors. "Set up a meeting," he told them. "Tomorrow morning. It's urgent." By 9 a.m., his financial team, lawyers, and Tristan were gathered in his home office, puzzled by the emergency summons. "I've made a decision," Michael announced without preamble. "I'm transferring the majority of my ownership shares in my companies into an irrevocable trust. The trust will fund teacher support programs in perpetuity." The room fell silent. Then, his lead financial advisor cleared his throat. "Mr. Jordan, we're talking about billions of dollars. Perhaps we should discuss this more thoroughly before—" "I've thought it through," Michael interrupted. "This isn't a split-second decision." He explained his reasoning. The Foundation was making real progress, but sustainable change required sustainable funding. By creating an irrevocable trust with his business holdings, he would ensure the Second Bell's work would continue for generations, regardless of shifting political winds or changing charitable trends. His team spent the day working out the details, drafting documents, and calculating projections. The structure would be complex, but the principle was simple. Michael Jordan was giving away a substantial portion of his wealth to ensure teachers would never again be forced to choose between dignity and survival in retirement. The next morning, Michael walked into the Second Bell headquarters and called an all-staff meeting. When everyone had gathered, he explained his decision. The room erupted in applause and tears. This unprecedented act of generosity would transform the Foundation from a well-funded charity into a permanent institution with the resources to create lasting change. News of Michael's decision broke later that day. Headlines around the world announced what financial experts were calling the most significant charitable commitment in sports history. Business channels analyzed the implications. Social media exploded with reactions ranging from stunned admiration to skepticism about his motives. When a reporter asked why he would give away such a substantial portion of his wealth, Michael's answer was simple: "Because someone taught me that real champions lift others up." 2 days later, Michael flew to Wilmington to tell Mrs. Winters personally. They sat on the porch of her house, the house that had begun this journey. "The trust is partly in your name," he told her. "The Eleanor Winters Teacher Dignity Trust." She shook her head, overwhelmed. "You've done too much already." "No," Michael said firmly. "I haven't done enough." As they sat in comfortable silence, watching the sunset, Mrs. Winters seemed lost in thought. "You know," she said finally, I've never told you the whole story about when you were cut from the varsity team." Michael looked at her, curious. "What do you mean?" "You were so devastated," she recalled. "I found you in the gym bathroom, remember? You told me you were quitting basketball entirely." Michael nodded. He remembered that day all too well. The crushing disappointment, the tears he couldn't control, the feeling that his dreams were over. "What you don't know," Mrs. Winters continued, "is what I did that night. I went home and wrote letters to every college scout I knew. 6 letters, all saying the same thing. That they should keep an eye on this determined young man named Michael Jordan, that cutting him was a mistake they wouldn't want to repeat." Michael stared at her in disbelief. "You did that for me?" She nodded. "And the next day, I brought you that basketball signed by the entire faculty, remember? To show you that people believed in you." "I still have that ball," Michael said softly, stunned by this revelation. "My point is," Mrs. Winters said, taking his hand, "sometimes the smallest act of faith in someone can change everything. You're doing that now for thousands of teachers, not just helping them financially, but showing faith in their worth, their dignity, their importance." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Michael understood at last. In helping Mrs. Winters and thousands of other teachers, he wasn't just giving back. He was passing forward the most valuable assist he'd ever received. The belief that he mattered, that his efforts were worth something, that someone was watching and caring about his journey. That, in the end, was the real victory. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. We'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop your location in the comments below for another inspiring story that will move you just as much. Click the video appearing on your screen right now. Stories of generosity and compassion like Michael and Mrs. Winters's remind us of the profound impact one person can make in the world.